We are joined here today by Grady Gammage Jr., founding partner of law firm Gammage and Burnham here in Phoenix, and a highly respected leader in Arizona's legal and public policy landscape. Grady, thanks for being here.
Good to see you. Yeah, nice to be here.
Good to
in
see
this
you.
brand new room. We're inaugurating this room today, I guess.
Absolutely.
Smells like fresh paint.
Grady, tell us a little bit about your background in general and how specifically you became interested in the topic of water in Arizona.
So people think I'm a water lawyer, and I always disabuse people. I am not a water lawyer. I have water lawyers who work at Gammage and Burnham that are the best around. I'm a land use lawyer, so I'm a zoning guy. So for approaching 50 years, I have been representing real estate developers, master plan communities, subdivisions, high-rise buildings, shopping centers, apartment complexes, whatever you need zoning on. So my professional career existed at sort of the intersection of real estate development and politics,
Okay.
the way you get real estate developments approved.
Right.
I did not do water issues. I got recruited by the city of Phoenix to run for the Central Arizona Project Board of Directors back in the 90s. And the reason they recruited me was it was just coming up on the time when the CAP canal was going to be finished and start delivering water to Phoenix.
Right.
And historically, the CAP board, which is a popularly elected, it's not like SRP where it's 1 acre, 1 vote, it's 1 man, 1 vote
Okay.
in the 3-county area by population. Historically, at that point, it had tended to be dominated by farmers and kind of leftover politicians.
Right.
And the city of Phoenix thought there was a need for people to be on the board that had a more urban perspective. And they recruited me because I have the same name as a big pink building. And they thought, oh, this guy will have an easy time getting elected because people recognize his name. And I have always been interested in public policy and kind of toyed with running for office, but I don't like partisan politics very much. And the CAP board is nonpartisan. So I thought, okay, I'll try it. And I did nothing. I didn't make a single campaign speech. I didn't spend a dime. I didn't kiss a baby. Nothing at all. The times have changed. People run for the board more aggressively now. But because the CAP is like the last thing you come to on the ballot, you vote for state mine inspector before you vote for the CAP board. You get there and you're like, what is this? I don't know. Let's see if I recognize any names. And it worked. The same name as a big pink building got me elected. So I got on the CAP board, and I thought, based on, at that point, like 25, 30 years worth of being in zoning hearings, I would see a lot of the same people.
Right.
That the people who made land policy would be an overlapping Venn diagram with people who make water policy. And that turned out to be completely wrong. They are utterly separate historically. I think that's changing going into the future. But traditionally, land use has been the province of planners, and water policy has been the province of engineers.
Right.
And they have very different viewpoints. Planners see a challenge, they need a new regulation.
Right.
Engineers, or I call them plumbers in this context, I do a talk called Planners and Plumbers. Plumbers see a challenge and they want to build something. A new pipe, a new ditch, a new dam, a new pump. And those differing approaches have been separate for generations, but they're starting to coincide.
Interesting.
Okay, so that's the long
That's perfect.
explanation.
No, that's great. And so just for the listeners that aren't too familiar with Arizona's water situation, help us understand what the situation with water in Arizona is. I know a lot of people outside of Arizona hear Arizona and water, and they think, well, it's just a desert. Tell us a little bit more background on the intricacies.
Yeah, so it's a lot more complicated than people think it is.
Right.
We have a fairly complex, fairly well integrated, quite sophisticated water system. And when I talk about it, I'm talking mainly about the urban water situation,
Right.
Which is sort of my province. And we really get water for urban growth in central Arizona from 3 different sources. One is the waters of the Salt and the Gila, which are fed by snowfall and rainfall on the Mogollon Rim and in the White Mountains. So waters internal to Arizona, surface water internal to Arizona. The second major source of water is the Colorado River, which flows through Arizona for 300 miles before it forms a common border with California. But we have the right to, under what's called the Law of the River, which is a complicated series of court decrees and treaties and congressional actions and federal statutes, we have the right to about 2.8 million acre feet of water from the Colorado. An acre foot is, take an acre of land, put a foot of water on it, that's an acre foot of water. It's about 325,000 gallons. It's about, in Metro Phoenix, what between 2.5 and 3 households would use in a year, depending on newer subdivisions, older subdivisions, grass, pools, whatever. Of that 2.8 million acre feet, we have a right to, and I should have quantified, the Salt and the Gila river system is about 800,000 acre feet a year that can only be under the SRP system used within Maricopa County.
Oh, okay.
The CAP water can be used in Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima. The 2.8 million that we have a right to from the river, about 1.5 million, you can get a little more than that, would come to central Arizona. The rest of it would be used on the river.
Okay.
That's challenged right now because there isn't that much water on the river.
Right.
The third source of water is groundwater. Groundwater is underground, hence the name, groundwater. It is prehistoric, by and large, that has been there for a very long time. And when you use it, you mine it, meaning it's just like copper or anything else. You dig it up, you use it, and it's gone. You can't put it back. It isn't renewable or sustainable. So it is different. Groundwater in Arizona is regulated where it is regulated by the Groundwater Management Act from the early 1980s. That is mainly urban regulation. There isn't a lot of regulation on agricultural use. Right. So the big picture of Arizona water is we have a lot of water under those three systems. Right. There's a lot of challenge right now, particularly to the Colorado River water. Right. Groundwater is, we'll talk about this more, is challenged because of the regulatory construct that exists. But statewide, about 70% of our water is used for agriculture. Interesting. Urban Arizona, meaning kind of Sun Corridor, Phoenix, Tucson, is more like 50%, a little less than 50% is used for agriculture. So there's still a whole lot of agricultural water use in Arizona, and that is going forward one of the big questions that we face.
And I feel like one of the questions that we hear, one of the comments we hear in media, or when we're talking to, we work with developers all across the state, and often you'll hear the feedback of, well, Arizona doesn't have enough water to continue this growth, and that's usually that growth is taking what was agricultural land and converting it to, well, in the last few years, industrial development. Is that accurate? Is that a true statement in the sense that we don't have enough to sustain?
It's hard to give a definitive answer to that. I have written 2 different reports when I was affiliated with the Morrison Institute and the Kyle Center for Water Policy about that question, sort of how long can we continue this growth rate based on current water supplies. Right. And the last time I revised that report was 2021. And the question I was asking is, how big can the Sun Corridor get based on current water supplies? I had done that report in 2011, and then I updated it in 2021 based on sort of new information about climate change and challenges on the Colorado River and groundwater. And my take is that we can probably get somewhere close to 9 million people in the Sun Corridor based on current water supply, if we get rid of all the agriculture in the Sun Corridor.
Get rid of all of it.
All of it that's in the Sun Corridor.
Okay.
Not along the river. You can still keep some on, but if you get rid of all the agriculture in the Sun Corridor, most of which going into the future is farming on Indian lands.
Right.
So we can't just decide to get rid of that.
Right, right. It's not a...
Tribal entities get to make those decisions. But if you get rid of all of it, which is kind of, you assume that water flows toward money, that price will determine,
Definitely.
then we can probably get within the range of 9 million people. And we're about at 6 to 6.5 or something in the Sun Corridor.
But heading that way, right? And
But we're heading that way. So that's 30 years, 40 years. The dilemma is you can't go for 30 or 40 years like that and then go, oh, geez, we're out of water.
here,
What do
yeah.
we do? It's not imminent. We're not going to run out of water anytime soon, in my view. But we have to start figuring out what we're going to do if we want to continue to grow beyond that point 30 years hence.
Right. Well, I think, and that's a great point, that number one, great to hear that we're not going to run out of water in the imminent future.
Yes, as a broker, I know you really care about that issue. Yeah.
Truly. But also the fact that Phoenix has and Arizona has a long history of preparing and putting things into place to accommodate future growth, and we know how it is to survive and thrive without
Yeah,
substantial
one of
water
the things
supply.
I tell people a lot when I talk to people from outside of Arizona is, we know it's dry here.
Yeah.
This is not news to
Step
us.
outside.
Yeah, this has been a central challenge of our existence, probably the central challenge of our existence, since the time of the Hohokam.
Right.
Other places in the U.S. are beginning to face water challenges that they never prepared for.
Right.
There was a period of time about a decade ago when Atlanta was down to less than 30 days water in storage to serve Atlanta. Well, if we have less than 10 years worth of water in storage, we get nervous.
Yeah. Sound the alarm bells.
Because we know we have to have that.
Yeah.
We can't depend on rainfall.
Right.
And the result of that is, when you hear about things where Arizona doesn't rank particularly well, spending on education, those kinds of things, where
Right.
we're like in that, thank God for Mississippi position, water is probably the thing we're at the top of the list. We're probably the best in the U.S. at water management.
And that's because of the history and because of what we've had to do to get to this point.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's-
I mean, there is an improbability about this many people living in the middle of the Sonoran Desert.
Right.
We made it happen by moving water to
Right.
where there's a lot of land and a lot of sunshine. And that resulted in our having very sophisticated management tools to deal with water that got us here.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of other markets and states, California being one of them, surprisingly, is maybe not surprisingly, is trying to play catch up in that sense.
Yeah,
right? And we're
it's
way ahead of
so
the game.
interesting to me. I meet with investors and developers thinking of coming to Arizona every so often, and sometimes you'll have a user who is considering coming here or maybe going to the Inland Empire, sort of San Bernardino area of California, or Las Vegas. And if they're not very sophisticated, they will make the assumption that Arizona has the biggest water challenge of those three places.
Yeah.
And the opposite is true.
Isn't that crazy?
They go to Las Vegas and they see Lake Mead and they think, oh, there's a big lake.
Yeah.
Well, most of that water is California's and Arizona's. It's
Right.
not Nevada's water.
Yeah.
Or they go to California and they think, well, the ocean is not far away, and there's got to be plenty of water there. And again, it's just not the same. And if you want to build a subdivision
Right.
in California, you have to show a 20-year assured water supply. And of course, in Arizona, it's a 100-year
100,
assured
yeah.
water supply.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think one thing that people are pointing to now that I'd love to get your take on is two big projects. Number one is TSMC, right? Is a
Right.
substantial project, the biggest I think we've ever seen in the state. What is the impact of that as far as Arizona's water supply, and is that going to be a huge drain? And coupled with that, data center development, we've seen that grow substantially over the last, call it 5-10 years specifically.
yeah.
No signs of slowing
So
down.
TSMC, chip manufacturing uses a lot of water, but it uses it in a very efficient way. They are able to, you have to get ultra purified water to wash the chips.
Right.
And so they purify it to a degree that nobody else does. And then they can use that water again and again and again. So
they're recycling internally.
they recycle it internally. And TSMC is on City of Phoenix water. So the big cities in the valley, the big historic cities, we call them the AMWA, which is an association of the big historic cities, all have a designation of assured supply and all have robust and varied water portfolios.
Right.
Phoenix is the biggest, Mesa's is big. Those places do not have immediate water challenges.
Right.
And so TSMC went to Phoenix, and Phoenix made a decision that they had enough water to support that. Interestingly, Phoenix is protective of their water supply. So they've turned away some other big users that might have come here because they felt like, let's not stretch it too far, kind of thing. I think we will see other chip manufacturing come on the heels of TSMC.
Absolutely.
And one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, okay, you got a finite portfolio of water. What do you want to do with it?
Right.
How do you want to use it? And chip manufacturing is one of the highest value adds for every gallon of water you put in.
Yep.
Water's embedded in everything. But chip manufacturing is really productive, high value use of water. Call centers and data centers rather than call centers are probably not as economically valuable. They're not. Data centers are big water users because of cooling.
Right.
Although more recent, newer data centers are much more efficient and they're able to use air cooling. And so most of the cities now discourage data centers that are purely water cooled because it's hugely water consumptive and it's not recycled the way it is in a chip menu. It's evaporated. Yeah. And as a result, you don't get a lot of jobs for every gallon of water that's input, unlike chip manufacturing, where you get a lot of jobs.
On the data center side, once it's delivered, those jobs, you don't really have a ton like you would on the TSMC fab, where it's continued employment, continued job growth.
Right.
It's a really interesting perspective. And one thing we haven't touched on yet is the residential side of this. Phoenix is, like growing like crazy from the residential side. There's a lot of homes that are going to be built to support both TSMC and just Arizona's organic growth. What does that do to the water supply, and how is that managed?
Residential subdivisions have gotten much more efficient over time. We used to say an acre-foot of water was one house. It's now more like 3 houses.
Right.
And the reason for that is the lots are smaller.
Right.
And there's a lot less grass. Yep. We've discouraged grass. And there are fewer swimming pools.
Right.
And the result of those things is far more efficient. There is a really complicated regulatory dilemma at the moment. That is something that most of your, hundreds of thousands of listeners, I'm sure, have probably heard about, which is that we're no longer permitting subdivisions outside of designated providers, which generally means the big cities, few other places. We're no longer permitting subdivisions to go in based purely on groundwater. And that was a decision by the Department of Water Resources based on their view of the availability of groundwater in areas on the edge of urban growth. So we're talking mostly about Buckeye and Queen Creek and Pinal County, where we have sort of shut down development on groundwater. This is a long, complicated conversation, but the Groundwater Management Act was not about growth management. It wasn't even really about water management. It was about consumer protection. So it got passed in 1980 after scandals about sort of dry land subdivisions, land fraud that was created in that era. And the idea was to disclose to people when they went to buy a lot whether or not there was a long-term water supply for that lot. Right. That's turned into a water management tool, which wasn't what it was originally created for. Right. And one of the anomalies there is it regulates for sale subdivisions. It doesn't regulate the 100-year assured water supply, doesn't regulate rental subdivisions, which have been an increasing niche in the market.
Yeah.
If you just build single-family homes and you rent them but don't sell them, you don't have to have a 100-year assured water supply. It doesn't regulate multifamily. It doesn't regulate commercial. It doesn't regulate industrial uses. So as we have kind of shut down lot development, industrial uses have been springing up in these remote areas that don't have an assured water supply. The legislature is grappling with that every year. There is a lot of pressure to change that, at least about for rent residential. And it will probably change at some point, but a whole lot of things about the Groundwater Management Act are sort of becoming dated and need to be revised. One more thing. Today, there is a meeting in the legislature about currently the hottest topic in water in Arizona, which is a series of different proposals to try to encourage the conversion of agricultural use to urban use. And here's another weird anomaly. You can't build a subdivision based on groundwater. But if that land has been farmed, you can go right on farming it forever with no replenishment. Replenishment means you have to put back underground some of the water you're using.
Right.
Subdivisions typically have to do that.
Right.
Farming doesn't. So in Pinal County and areas on the west side, you got a section of farmland. You can't convert it to housing anymore, even though the housing would decrease the water use by 3/4. Houses use less water than farms by
which most people, I think,
huge.
Are astonished to hear that that's the case.
You can't convert that farmland, but the farmer can go on farming it forever. Completely depleting the groundwater underneath it. Because the Groundwater Management Act only regulates subdivision.
Right.
That's what's happening now. We're encouraging farms to stay in business, even though the farmer would be economically better off selling for a subdivision.
Of course,
even though the subdivision would have much higher economic benefit to the state, you can't do it. So there are proposals to try to come up with an incentive to allow groundwater to be used again for subdivisions.
Right.
It would have to be replenished, and the conversion rate of when you stop farming, which uses like 6 or 7 acre feet per acre, you convert to a subdivision at 1.5 to 2 acre feet per acre. A bill passed, and the disclosure here, my office represents many of the developers proposing these bills. A bill passed in the legislature last year, and the governor vetoed it. The Department of Water Resources is now considering doing it by regulation rather than by legislation, but the legislature wants again to pass something, so we don't know where it's going to wind up yet, but something needs to happen there to sort of free up subdivision growth to continue. When it got shut down, that got nationwide negative publicity about Arizona. Arizona's out of water, they can't build houses anymore. Not at all the case. There are thousands of lots out there already permitted that can go forward. And if you're in a big city, you can go ahead and build. But any hint that Arizona is low on water gets New York Times front page kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It seemed like it was out of nowhere, and it's helpful to have that background of, hey, here's what triggered that conversation. Here's what triggered the media kind of frenzy on Arizona is out of water.
Yeah, and, you know, there have been a lot of criticisms of what the Department of Water Resources did, many of which I share. What they did is they changed the way they did modeling as to how much water there is. And in my view, they made some bad assumptions. They made an assumption that all development that would be zoned or permitted would develop at 100% of all the units that are allowed. That never happens, never. They made an assumption that all those units would be built at once. Physically impossible. I mean, it doesn't happen. And they made an assumption about where wells would be distributed that was, in the view of most hydrologists that I have talked to, was not realistic about where the wells are. Based on that set of assumptions, they found that there was a 4% shortfall. This is the Maricopa County number. A 4% shortfall in the amount of water needed to support development over a 100-year horizon. You know, if you're within 4% over a 100-year horizon, you're in pretty damn good shape.
Yeah,
if Social Security were that good, we'd all be excited. And yet, in defense, so the Central Arizona home builders have filed suit over these issues. But to defend the Department of Water Resources for a minute, they don't have a lot of finely grained regulatory tools.
Right.
They have to either say there is or there isn't an assured water supply. And they looked at it all and they said, we don't think there is. The consequences of that were very negative, and it should not have been, that declaration, in my view, should not have been issued without some path to sort of fix the problem.
Right.
Because that's what resulted in all the negative publicity.
Right, that's interesting. So, and you brought up Buckeye, and quickly I want to touch on the fact that Buckeye, I believe, just announced a water campus that they're going to do, and that's in an effort, as I understand it, to alleviate that concern and accommodate future growth. Do you see more cities taking that step, and is that a proper long-term solution?
You know, one of the things that's going to happen is we are going to reuse effluent for a broader range of uses, like drinking water. We have to. That's going to happen. Now, in my view, not everybody agrees with me about this. I don't view that as a new water supply. If it's effluent, that means you've already used it. You know, so it's basically already built into the water supply. Reusing it makes the use more efficient, but it's not new water to the system. So I don't see reuse of effluent as a way to stretch that 30 to 40 year horizon of growth.
Just more efficient management of the existing.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fair. And so with all this and with the, understanding the background and the challenges that we face and the rhetoric that is pushing back on this a little bit, where do you see Arizona going, and what things should we make sure that we accomplish as both a state and a region to accommodate the future growth? Because I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. The growth of Arizona and the growth of Phoenix Metro is continue to exceed expectations.
I think that's right. I think there are economic and political forces at work that make Arizona continue to be an attractive place for people to move, and that will continue. So I think a number of things have to happen. The Groundwater Management Act framework has to change a bit. Ag to urban, I think, will be one of the first of those things to change. Don't know the details yet, but I think something will happen that will encourage farmland in the path of urban growth to be converted to subdivisions. The second thing that I think will happen is that there will be regulation of non-single-family ownership subdivisions.
Right. And you're talking about the build-to-rent communities.
The build-to-rent, the multifamily, industrial. I think it will be a different kind of regulation, and we haven't really come to grips with that yet. We haven't talked about rural stuff because I'm not a rural guy. I'm an urban guy, but I think increasingly Arizona's rural areas are going to be challenged. We have been incredibly fortunate in Arizona that we grow crops and houses in the same place, the Sun Corridor. So as the Sun Corridor is urbanized, farmland has transitioned. That is different than California or Colorado, where in California, the crops are in the central valleys, the people live on the coast. In Colorado, it's one side of the mountains the other. So they have had an ag and urban dynamic that has been fighting. That hasn't been the case for us. That's going to change because we will increasingly need to bring additional water off the Colorado River. There's a lot of water over there. Even in these times of a decreased flow in the river, there is water available there that can be moved. Again, my office has done some of that. It's not easy, and it is threatening to people who live along the river. Threatening to their economy, their agricultural economy. So I think we need to face up to some measures that will preserve the important high-value crops along the river. The vegetables in Yuma are very high value and support a robust economic ecosystem, and that needs to happen. I think we will need to begin planning another piece of plumbing. And it could be moving more water from the CAP canal, through the CAP canal, from the river, and banking it underground in central Arizona. Or it could be desalinization in the Sea of Cortez, which is referred to as the Gulf of California, but I understand we're going to rename it the Gulf of Arizona because we voted for Trump after all.
I love the renaming of the Gulfs.
Yeah, exactly. It could be bringing water from there up, and we should build a flexible enough plumbing system that we could do one thing or the other with it. But those are multi-billion-dollar investments over a long period of time, and would take the federal government being functional, which it's kind of not at the moment. So those are all pieces of things we need to do, I think.
Interesting. It's and I think one question I did have for you is on Arizona as it relates to other states, and specifically was in the news very recently, what happened in Los Angeles, right? The fires, and you heard the stories of there not being water in the hydrants and not having access to water to fight these fires. I don't think people see that as much of a threat to Arizona, but what can you tell me about what do you think happened there, and how does that?
Yeah, so the problem is what happened in Los Angeles is they were trying to use an urban water fire suppression system, hydrants designed to fight house fires, to fight a wildfire, and it's just different. The scale is so different. You could have had every one of those hydrants pressurized, fully flowing, and it still wouldn't have been enough. It wouldn't. It was just not enough. In Los Angeles, wildfires are an urban threat.
Right.
In a way, I don't think they are in Arizona. They are in Flagstaff. They are in Payson. They are in Prescott. But the landscape palette of Phoenix isn't, generally speaking, thick enough to support that kind of level of fire. We just don't have as many plants and things, nor do we have the Santa Ana wind phenomenon, or the geography of Los Angeles is beautifully adapted to wildfire. And probably, if you want to talk about places where you shouldn't have built a big city, people always put Phoenix at the top of the list. Los Angeles is probably worse in a lot of ways.
It's very, very interesting. I think that what that did, if nothing else, was bring to people's attention, hey, let's look at external or just threats in general that maybe we didn't consider from a climate perspective. From water management was brought up, but I think it's much larger than that in Los Angeles. Is there?
Yeah, and I think part of the second book I wrote about Phoenix, which you have a copy of, which you could show, and this is available on Amazon.
Great read.
Tries to look at the sustainability of Phoenix compared to other urban areas, because there is a belief that Phoenix is the least sustainable big city in the United States. There's a book called Bird on Fire that takes that position. I think that's wrong. Our challenge is what we're talking about today, is that it's really hot and really dry here. And frankly, hot is a harder challenge to deal with than dry. We can move water to deal with dry. We can't really do a lot about hot. But neither of those is as big a challenge as increasing hurricanes or wildfires in Los Angeles. There are climate challenges out there for every city, but some of them are much more difficult to deal with than ours. If sea level is going to rise by 4 to 6 feet because of climate change, what happens to Manhattan? It's a whole lot more expensive problem than dealing with the challenges Phoenix has.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I guess I want to make sure I ask the question for our developer listeners. What the message you have to developers, for big users evaluating coming into Phoenix versus a Utah versus a California or a Texas we've competed a lot against from an economic standpoint? Is there any concern, or is there a message you have regarding Phoenix's water supply or overall?
Again, I think compared to Colorado, Utah, or Nevada, or New Mexico, we probably have more sustainable and more robust water supply for urban growth than any of those.
Right.
Texas is a little bit different because Texas essentially allows unfettered use of groundwater, and they have a lot of groundwater. So they are not nearly as careful about water management as we are because they don't have to be, but groundwater is finite. So at some point, you're going to run out of it. Now, they probably have enough of a ramp, but they don't even try to deal with groundwater overdraft.
And that's a problem that not they're going to deal with today, but much later on.
Much later, yeah, it could be a long ways off.
The messaging that both the Greater Phoenix Economic Council and GPEC, who's put together a ton of great deliverables on the Phoenix's position and largely Arizona's position and stance on where we are with water today, why that's not a problem, and why it's incentivizing companies to move here, is that security, that preparedness, that readiness, and a number of different items that I think are overlooked often by companies that either don't consider Phoenix as an option, or maybe overlook it as an option compared to Texas, like we said, Austin, Colorado, and New Mexico, which I hadn't thought about either. But any other final words for both, again, developers, the future of Arizona? What should we know? What should we be considering?
I in many ways, I think the biggest problem that we face isn't about climate or geography. It's about dysfunctional politics. Arizona works because of massive federal investment in SRP and CAP, and because of a bipartisan consensus that water was the thing we had to get right. Water was, the consensus is we need all the water we can get. We need to be careful what we do with it, and we all need to get along well enough together to make decisions about infrastructure and building things. It isn't just a challenge for Arizona. Dysfunctional politics is a challenge for everywhere in the United States. But if you try to imagine Congress agreeing to fund another CAP, it's almost inconceivable to imagine they could get together and do that, or building another dam or anything like that. And if you watch the difficulty the Arizona legislature has had in dealing with what should be relatively easy issues, some revisions to the Groundwater Management Act, some kind of ag to urban incentive to allow development to start up again, it's not happening. And that challenge is the one that worries me the most. We have to get over believing that there is a Republican answer to everything and a Democratic answer to everything, and the two can never be on the same page. That will make Arizona less sustainable. That is a threat way beyond climate or geography.
Interesting. Awesome. Well, Grady, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. Anything else?
Glad to do it.
Before I forget, again, the future of the suburban city, rather.
It's a bit out of date, but,
check it out. Amazon and wherever you get books.
Yeah.
Grady, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Thanks.